Intel's having a really hard time at the moment. If you look at their main competition, it was NVIDIA. Because they were into graphics and gaming, their chip design actually lent itself very well to AI. And so as technology as an enabler, Intel's technology didn't enable AI in the same way NVIDIA's did. Hi, I'm Carrie Lomas. Welcome to this Oxford Tea Talk. My job at the University Side Business School is as an Associate Fellow. I teach and I tutor, typically in innovation, strategy and sustainability. I'm really excited to be here and also to welcome Professor Marc Ventresca.
Hello everyone, Marc Ventresca here. As Carrie said, I'm on the faculty here at the University of Oxford, both at Side Business School and also a governing body fellow at Wolfson College. We're here today to talk about innovation, something that everyone thinks about, everyone hears about. We want to provide for you some insights that come from our research and the work we've done. Carrie and I have worked together for a long time. She was an alum, she did one of our degrees, and we've worked together since then on many different projects. So we want to open up a set of questions which look kind of like this. People talk about innovation a lot. Often they think that innovation is the outcome of a smart person or a good idea. And we're going to argue generally that innovation is a function like any other that needs to be funded, vetted, curated. It's a process. Organizations need to invest in innovation. We're also going to talk about some of the positives and negatives. For example, very common today to have people say, to be innovative, everyone has to be innovative in the organization. And we're probably here to say that may not be the case. There are lots of reasons why that's a bad idea. So we're both interested in sort of promoting good practices and insights, but also kind of puzzling over some of the kind of popular comments that get made about innovation. We think about innovation really beyond technology also. This is another common fallacy, that innovation is about a new technology or deploying technology. I think we're going to have in this conversation some observations about the artificial intelligence community and the artificial intelligence technologies. We're going to be supportive of the possibility and also skeptical of how they're being introduced and used. So from my perspective especially, innovation is about recombining elements into something useful, new, practical. It's not only new things, it's also recombining existing elements, bringing together existing elements with new ideas and new practices and new materials. It's also fundamentally about what you do with that, how you implement on innovation. I think in our research and in our teaching today, we are less and less likely to talk about innovation separate from implementation, getting things done, making use of emerging technologies, but also new kinds of organization, new kinds of supply chains. In other words, innovation spans many activities in an organization and hence has to be firm-wide or agency-wide, not only about IT or not only about technology. I'd like to also begin to bring Carrie into the conversation. If you could just give us, Carrie, some of your observations. I know that you've led a number of technology units over the years. Tell us a little bit about your views on innovation, if you would.
Thanks, Marc. So my career was 27 years across Intel and IBM, so obviously two global world-leading technology organizations. One of the challenges, as you say, is a lot of customers actually come to us, because a lot of my work was customer-facing, with we've got a new technology, what can we do with it? Yeah. And so externally with clients, then part of my job was trying to actually understand what their problems were and think about it from a problem and solution perspective, because technology, as we know, isn't the only answer. And often innovation is about your processes, thinking about what processes you use. And that can be as simple as in any department, from accounting to CRM, looking after your clients and understanding their own businesses. With big companies, of course, they typically are going to have a huge R&D department. Right. So the other challenge is that people think of it as the R&D's job and not as everyone's job. Right. But quite rightly, as you said, also on a day-to-day basis, you don't constantly want to be, I've got to innovate, I've got an idea, what do I do about this? Because we absolutely need to have a balance of keeping business stable, particularly with all the change that's going on around us. So part of, I think, the challenge and opportunity in large organizations is understanding what's working well, what trends are out there. And you can do that by, I call it guddling, guddling fish, listening to what's going on in the world, talking to a wide variety of people, not only C-suite and not only the new companies, but having that understanding of the trends and the movements. And obviously, as a sociologist, your background of understanding what's going on in the world, because that shapes a lot of what we need to innovate and how we're going to innovate, rather than just thinking, what do I do with, IoT, quantum, AI, but actually looking deeper at how the world is moving and changing so that we can actually create those future possibilities that you always talk about in class, and shape those with innovation that's not only about technology, but also about people.
Great. You're making a number of really interesting points. I'm going to pick up on a couple of them, if that's okay. First is that technology is enabling, it's not defining. The other point you made, though, is really important. A very common issue in a lot of firms, people saying, we're really successful, why should we innovate? Waste of money, too uncertain, difficult. Why would we try to change things? We're so successful. And I think what we've come to know, I think both through experience, you and I both in experience, through our research, through working with a lot of students, is that the issue there is you don't notice that you need to innovate until it's too late. Really, really common. Profits are still good, still a global leader, success 3, 5, 50, 70 years on, and nobody feels like, why would we change that? And of course, what they're forgetting is something really basic. It's what we call that exploit-explore tension. That tension between how much of today is about making money today and using fully resources that are available, but also today, how much of today needs to be about tomorrow, imagining, prototyping, inventing, failing, right? And I think more and more colleagues in strategy and innovation, operations, are thinking about that exploit-explore ratio. How much of today is about today? How much of today is about tomorrow? And I think that gets at 2 points you made. One is you need to be talking to everybody, not only the C-suite, top down, but also insights and ideas come from everywhere. And I think the exploit-explore is something I really hope our listeners have a chance to reflect on, because again, things can look good for now, but there's an underlying time frame, there's an underlying set of processes which may well be outside of the purview of your firm or your agency that then come up and sort of surprise you one day. And so I think, again, as you said, too often innovation is seen as a particular solution to a particular problem, rather than understanding innovation as a process that keeps us attentive to the wider ecosystem. It keeps us attentive to what current rivals are doing, but it also keeps us attentive to what firms and agencies far from what we do are doing. This is, I think, part of the issue there.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, do you agree with that?
Absolutely. And if I look back at, the case studies that I was taught by you and that we use widely at Oxford, there's some really obvious ones that everybody knows, the Netflix story, Amazon, they began selling books online, when e-commerce and the internet came out in the 90s. And Uber, big case studies that people are aware of. But if I look at my own career and Intel's having a really hard time at the moment. And if you look at their main competition, it was NVIDIA, so very tech-driven companies. But NVIDIA, I'm going to say by happenstance, I absolutely love what they're doing, but because they were into graphics and gaming, their chip design actually lent itself very well to AI. And I think Intel hadn't necessarily foreseen how that was coming. And in fact, part of the reason for my move to IBM was to go and run an AI team. And because they didn't necessarily see it coming and the technology didn't line up as well behind it as well as NVIDIA's did. For NVIDIA, it was the smooth move into the future and the next wave, which, we kind of all knew was coming. But chips take a long time to design and to manufacture. And so as technology as an enabler, Intel's technology didn't enable AI in the same way that NVIDIA's did. And so they've lost a lot of market share, huge downsizing going on. And we see companies fall and fail, completely. One of the classics being Kodak, who foresaw that everything we did, taking photos, was going to be done, on
a camera,
on a camera in our pockets on our phones. Right. And it's only when we sit in circumstances like this that we're actually on, proper cameras nowadays. Nearly everything is done amazingly by our phones. But actually, in that instance, Kodak actually explored digital.
Very well.
Patented it, put it aside, didn't believe it was the future. And that's the challenge is, what do you really believe and what do you think is going to happen? And I think that's why we have to look much broader and take into account these signals that are coming to us, and taking a step back, particularly as leaders, listening to, I dare say, the younger people in the organisations a lot of the time, and hearing what's going on and what's changing in their worlds, because that is often, they're going to be the people that are going to use your solutions for the future.
That's right. Interesting. Two comments, two observations. I think something you said right now really struck me, and that is, there are many. An organization isn't one thing. A firm or an agency are many people with many kinds of expertise. And in each of those worlds, different things are happening. And it's hard to see the composite or the whole. And again, your point earlier about talking to lots of people, talking across the organization, up and down in the organization, really is a safeguard, because often the C-suite, the very senior colleagues, are absent from a lot of the detail. And so by listening broadly, you're reminded of things that you might have forgotten or not noticed. And that's where the interesting work is for innovation, right? And I think that's a really important point, to be talking broadly. Today, one group, one unit may say, we're doing very well. Another group say, we're having some problems, but they don't connect those. They try to solve them locally, as opposed to saying that's a firm level challenge. Your point about Intel in some ways and NVIDIA. I also think what you said really reminds me of sort of a whole body of research that we're interested in, which is about the plurality of worlds that occur. As we move more and more today toward platforms and ecosystems, it becomes even less plausible to imagine a single vertically integrated firm where there is control at the top and everyone complies, right? And so as we see more and more of the economy being gestated in platforms and ecosystems, that willingness and that ability to look outside, to look across, becomes even more central. And I think that, you've mentioned artificial intelligence a couple of times. You've mentioned some other of the emerging technologies. One concern we may want to have about that is, too often, too many people see them as a thing. Oh, it's AI, as opposed to realizing there are many elements of an artificial intelligence. There are data for learning from, there are practical applications, there's the design of the AI itself in its home or in its early and original activities. And so, what we're trying to do in some of the work we're doing, one of my colleagues, Reza Kalantar-Najad, and I are looking at sort of AI and how it's affecting innovation. And one of the claims we're making is, when you look out at the landscape today, there are probably three scenarios. AI as an assistant, AI is helping you be more efficient or find things more quickly. I think pretty mundane at this point. But AI also as a kind of a trusted insight giver. AI that leads us to new questions or helps us see things. And finally, AI in a scenario that literally does the innovation itself. And I think that kind of insight reminds us, yes, there's a role for emerging technologies. They're not the same. There are many roles. And then it depends on what a firm or an agency does, how they choose to design and use that AI, how they implement it. And it comes back to this question around implementing. Early on, I think, when you look at the language from Schumpeter on in innovation, in the words of a colleague who we value a lot, technologies are bundles of possibilities, right? Technologies are bundles of possibilities. What you do with those bundles, how you wrap them, how you combine them, how you engage them, really shapes what a technology can do. That's a very different view from how many people view, colloquially, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
It's seen as a stable, fixed activity. And I think part of my interest intellectually, as a teacher, as a researcher, is to open that up and say, nothing is settled until very, very far along in the process. And we need to be experimenting and failing and learning and encountering difficulties to keep improving on what will eventually become a dominant designer, what will eventually become the way that we understand these tools.
Yeah, and I'd like to pick up on that. So if you think about Jaworski's work on the evolution of new markets, and everybody lumps technology into one thing, but actually it's many things to many people, and it's choices about what problems do you choose to solve in the world.
Yes, right.
And that kind of takes us to one of the other challenges we have, which is in one of the other tea talks, which is thinking about sustainability in a triple bottom line. Because everything that we do nowadays, we need firms that are going to become net positive. We need people to think about the environment. We need them to think about society as a whole. We are moving to a further and further, very poor world and a very rich world, and we need to think about how we're actually going to bring those two back closer together. And I think that as we do so, as we think through technology, as we think through what problems we're solving, we just need to have the back of our mind what the externalities on these things. And when we talk about AI, we're not saying that companies are all going to set up and start creating these huge LLMs, but it's how do you want to use it? What problems are you trying to solve? What do you see out there that you can try and stretch? And part of my job as a practitioner, so being an associate fellow, as you know, the reason that you bring us back in is because we use these academic frameworks and the understanding of the research to then say, how can I apply that better to my situation, my company, my firm, and my clients, my entire stakeholder set as we move away from just shareholders, but understanding those. And I think that, again, that kind of how do you implement it? Of course, you can bring consultancy firms in to help you implement it. But actually, you can sit and think about what's the challenges I'm having and how can we best use whatever it is, the people that we have, that recombining of what we have to create something better for the future.
Yeah, great.
And whilst we talk about the information economy, we need to be actually really valuing and rewarding people for the collaboration economy. Because I think that, along with conscious capitalism, has to be our future because there's so many signals out there.
Yeah, great. You shared with us early on some of your experience in large multinational firms, Intel and IBM. I know that in the last few years, you've dramatically changed your whole identity and your whole work experience, and you founded several startups. Tell us a little bit about that, including the sustainability startup, if you would, but also help me understand how you see those worlds as different or similar, right? In other words, you're someone who's always been a pioneer. You've always been early on into early technologies. You've always been somebody who took on a leadership role at various levels. And now you're working largely with yourself and a few others. So what does leading look like for you? What does sustainability mean in your ventures? And what does it mean to work in a venture of 20 people as opposed to 20,000? I'm just curious, you are attentive to innovation in many kinds of contexts. I'm curious how you think about those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So for me, one of the biggest things, of course, is the huge amount of resources that you have in an Intel or an IBM or any of the other large corporations or firms around the world. And that's so very different from when you start out on your own. We started as like 2, 3, 4, 5 of us. And now we're 10 with 10 contractors that work for us, often in specialist roles across sustainability and retail. And I think that the things that are the same are that the problems are still the same. They're just different scales of them. And as my father says, it's just different amount of zeros on the end of it. It doesn't really matter, but people are the same and the challenges that we have are the same. Clearly, you have the opportunity to be more agile as a small team because you can make decisions. I think empowerment is actually even more important, not less important. So my team absolutely have to know that they can go off and make a decision and do something without coming back to me all the time. Whereas I think people might think in a smaller org that it's a very small pyramid, but actually it's not. They'll tell you they have complete autonomy over some of their work. But we have very strong strategy, we have very strong values, and we go back to those all the time when we make decisions. And from an innovation perspective, I think we have to be even more innovative because even with my 3 blue badges, Oxford, Intel and IBM, I've always been blue. We have to make sure that people understand that our expertise is very deep, even though we're working for this very small company, and innovation has to be at the core of everything that we do. But that still means explore, exploit. So we still have a core of what we do that is there, and then we go off and investigate different areas. And in COVID, that meant actually completely different businesses as well. So we got a government grant, an Innovate UK grant, to put education out online to 3 to 5-year-olds for all the parents that were at home and adults that were trying to look after small children but don't know what the curriculum looks like. But each of those was 3 to 5 minutes online, and then activities to actually physically do, because we didn't want children all online. So I've had great fun looking at those things, but you still have to have a core of what you do, what you're going to innovate around.
Nice, yeah.
Marc, what's your comments on sort of finally wrapping up, because we're getting towards the end of our tea talk session today, which went very quickly, because we always enjoy exploring these areas.
Yeah, I think there's some questions we can look at too, and I just I'll say a couple of things. Thank you for providing grist to reflect on. I think as I know you, as you're talking today, as I've seen you in classes, as I've seen you teaching, tutoring, I think you're someone who is very pragmatic. You have a commitment to the big ideas, and you also think about how to get them done. And I think that mix is more and more part of innovation. I think most people know the history of things like Bell Labs, large-scale, intensive R&D labs, lots and lots of money, lots and lots of people with PhDs. Very important, right? I think that's shifting, though, in a world where more and more businesses are flat, small, distributed. We work a lot with this idea of distributed innovation, where you're working across a platform or you're working with many kinds of experts. And I think that's the challenge. It's why that my colleague Reza Kalantarnejad and I have been interested in what's the impact of AI on innovation. I think that's giving us really clear signals about different ways to use an AI technology, right? Different kinds of functions that can be helpful in those ways. I think it's also something that we said early on. Innovation isn't something special and esoteric. It's often very grounded in the reality of people's lives, in the reality of what they're trying to do. I mean, we have innovation that is getting us to Mars, an aspiration, a lot of activity, a lot of hope. We have innovation that's also figuring out how to find a lost dog, right? And so I think, what's important, I think, as a teacher for me, is realizing that innovation is many things, and we need to be a little more precise. Is it normal, routine, everyday innovation? Really important. Firms make a lot of money from doing everyday, normal innovation, closer to customers, all that kind of thing. Very important, right? But that's not going to help you imagine or build the future. And so we begin to distinguish between routine or everyday innovation, more transformative innovations, innovations that are trying to do better what we do today, exploit, but also innovations that help us reimagine the core activities of a whole system of people and expertise and so forth. And you see this over and over. I'll tell you, I'll finish on this. We just wrapped up one of the diploma in organizational leadership modules. So these are, 60 people, mid-30s, early 40s, who are, 10 or 15 years into a career. And they were, as a group, they kept saying in this course on leading, the work of leading, this module, they kept saying, but what about ethics? What about accountability? And, it got me thinking something that you just said. You can have a young team, a big team, a little team, an team of experts. People have to feel some kind of accountability, some kind of buy-in to invest, to work hard. The example I used with this diploma group was, think about all the Japanese innovations in manufacturing in the 60s and 70s and 80s, right? So it was shocking to people in the West to say a line worker can pull the plug on the line and stop the line, right? And of course, what I said to the class then was, yes, and they did that after being thoughtful about what's the implication of doing that. And then they were asked, why did you stop the line? And so it's moving those kinds of innovations in human resources, in employment, in the activities of work. It's always saying, okay, you can do that, but understand why you're doing it and what the implications of that are. And I think that's a story that will find a lot of interest today. People talk about responsible innovation, ethical innovation. I think this is where this field, as a field of study and a field of practice, is going. Why are we innovating, right? What's the value here? What are we trying to do? There's a space clearly for blue sky innovation, incredible imagination among basic science researchers, material scientists, terrific, right? Blue sky research. But there's also an increasing taste for, let's call it, applied innovation that has an ethical frame or that has a sense of implications. How would we, in a world of work at home, how do we begin to renew a commitment to organizational cultures? In a world of dramatic changes in how we work, where we work, with whom we work, your point about collaboration, that needs to be grounded in a sense of, why are we doing this? What's the point? So I think that innovation for me is a broad term, and as we've talked about today, it is a broad term, but when we get concrete about it, when we think about what you've done to build a firm that looks at sustainability in retail, that kind of precision and focus really helps us say all innovation is not the same.
Yeah.
It differs enormously by scale, purpose, activity, background, and so forth.
Yeah. Okay.
How about you? What's your...
Well, so I was going to talk about innovation for purpose as well. So I think it's really important that we do understand our purpose. But if your purpose is far more about getting energy to, and you are something that's not very sustainable, but getting energy to everybody, that's okay. What I want people to do is then, as they innovate, really think about how does that impact environment and society at the same time. And incremental innovation, to can we actually... pull oil out in a more sustainable manner, less damage to the environment. And then, of course, the next part of that is renewable energy. So all of these models, all of these businesses, every industry has the opportunity to do things in a different way. Should we move to our questions?
Let's do those questions, Let's do that.
Question. So I'm going to read this one out to you. How can leaders design innovation ecosystems that don't just adapt to uncertainty, but metabolize it into continuous ethical growth? And this was a LinkedIn question. So
it came to us from LinkedIn,
absolutely.
Really interesting, really important question. Let me give it a go, and then happy to have you correct me and fix me. So the question says, all firms face uncertainty and ambiguity. How can we begin to use that uncertainty and ambiguity that is pervasive, not just to solve it or fix it, but to actually metabolize it? I'm reading that as saying to let that firm learn how to actually generate value, sustainability, and ethical action from that. Innovation here may or may not be in terms of a new product or new technology. It may be a new mindset. It may be bringing senior executives from other industries that have learned from that. Your point earlier in this conversation, sustainability is no longer a nice to have. Every firm has to become sustainable in terms of its outcomes. So I think the question is the right question. How do we turn the uncertainty that all those firms face into not a simple, let's solve that today, but instead into a prod to keep us thinking, how can we do better? How can we begin to make a sustainable solution? Which probably means we're going to start out not very well, not very smart, and not with a lot of rigor, but we're going to try some things out, we're going to seize on those, and then we're going to have to figure out how to let that uncertainty percolate up through the decision processes and the values and ethos of the leadership. Let me be clear here. I'm not saying that leaders have to become noble people who only think of the good of the earth, right?
Absolutely.
I think that's an implausible thing to say.
Absolutely.
I'm saying we can build organizational routines, principles, practices, organizational purpose that helps us take in those uncertainties and say we have to work with these over time and over the range of issues. We're not going to solve it today.
And I'm completely with you. I'm absolutely not against people making money, and it's not about that. But it's about everybody thinking through that adapting to the uncertainty and to actually use that as a catalyst for growth. I think it's completely
I mean,
possible.
people use the word mindset a lot these days. And it's unclear what mindset means.
Shift. I think it's
mind shift, exactly.
It's from my current position of where I am is how I see it, to actually being open to other prompts, other inputs, and thinking that. And I also think you've got to go back to your strategy and be prepared to review it with the different information.
With these different assumptions about what the outcomes are. I agree.
Yeah.
And as you're saying, takes time and goes forward. Good. Really important question. Yeah, I've got a question for you too, from our LinkedIn friends, and someone was kind enough to put this in. What are some common cultural blockers that prevent sustained innovation, even in ambitious companies?
So I'm going to say this is an easy one because I see the same things time and time again. And because we're up against time, because we always have wonderful deep chats. But I think some basic things like if your culture says that we've always done it this way, if you're afraid of failure, you don't provide psychological safety into people that are trying out new things. If you're too hierarchical or you're too siloed, so we talked about the pyramid, but if everything has to go through so many layers to even figure out how to buy a different pencil this time because you think it might be useful. If you're in silos and you don't talk to each other, these are basic things, but you see time and time again, big companies struggling with how to break these down, particularly because we're so global. Whilst I've always been a fan of hybrid working, and Intel did hybrid working right back in the 90s, a couple of days a week. What I think is really hard is you're not having the water cooler moments, you're not having the coffees, you're typically not socializing now. I've heard people say, I don't need new friends, I've got all my friends from school and university. But I think those things really stifle innovation because they don't allow people to be able to come in and say, okay, this is a joint problem, or we're seeing this in different departments. Yeah. So I think for me, those are some of the really key things. And culture is so crucial to innovation. You have to have that, and building innovation that breaks down silos, that allows you not to have to go through 6 layers just to try out an idea, have a discussion about an idea. I think are real cultural blockers that I see through big organizations.
Let me add one footnote. I think you're talking about culture in a really fruitful and contemporary way. Not a single culture, not an overall culture, but culture as interaction, talking, being around each other, whether that's virtually or in person, right? So your view of culture, I think, is really important. It's away from that long-time view that everyone has to think the same thing, everyone has to see the world the same way. Instead, it says culture in the old anthropological sense is people interacting, talking, doing things, arguing, debating. As you know, at Oxford, when we teach, we really favor this idea that learning is about debate. It's about making claims or making propositions and having people debate you. And then the classrooms are much more lively when there's disagreement. We may at the end agree that we agree, but at least early on, there are people saying things that are provocative or outrageous or nobody believes. And if you think in over time, many, many of the things we cherish most today in terms of innovation started out as crazy or not understood or seen as irrelevant, right? And so you realize, as you said, there's this time dimension, and part of that time dimension is debate, conversation. And I think that's the culture that I think you're talking about. It's the culture we would want to talk about. I tend to say in class, you have to find common ground, not agreement, but enough agreement to be able to communicate. Yeah. But beyond that, not so.
And I also think that breakthroughs come from finding that commonality, not your differences. Yeah. But you have to explore the differences at the beginning, because that's really where those, that mixture of the two is where the breakthroughs happen. Yeah. So, Marc, thank you so much for your time. I always love chatting with you, as you know, and particularly about innovation and now how we apply it to sustainability. So I'd like to conclude today for our tea talk and say thank you very much to our watchers and listeners, because I've certainly enjoyed the session, and I hope you have understood a little bit more about innovation from an academic and an implementation practitioner perspective. Thank you.
Carrie, thank you very much. It's really great to have a chance to think in this sort of organized way with you and to talk for this long a time. So thank you for making the time.